Welcome to the broadcast tonight. We'll take a critical look at the new television season with Marvin Kittman, Jeff Jarvis, and David Bianculli. Also, tennis legend Arthur Ashe, Bud Collins of the Boston Globe, and Elise Bergen from the Women's Tour and USA Network rate this year's action in the U.S. Open. We began with a man who is one of the most internationally recognized figures in Israeli politics. Until the defeat of the Likud party in June, Benjamin Netanyahu was the government's leading spokesman to the world in his role as Deputy Foreign Minister. Continuing to represent Likud in the Knesset, Netanyahu is hoping to change his party's fortunes by running for its top position in January. And we're pleased to have him now to talk about some extraordinary developments in Israel. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here and see you again. There is this announcement. Israelis disclose, this is tomorrow morning's New York Times, Israelis disclose talks with Syria on steps to peace, settling principles. Main issues are treaty and return of Golan Heights territory. Israel and Syria are negotiating the terms of a joint document setting forth the principles for working out a peaceful settlement between the two countries. This sounds like land for peace. Are you on board for this?
There's not a lot of land, Charlie, to...
it's in damn important land, too, as some would say.
Well, you know, the idea of land for peace got its start by the negotiations that Egypt and Israel negotiated in the Sinai. One thing you have to understand that makes this negotiation a lot tougher, even though they're beginning, is the fact that the Sinai is dozens of times bigger than the Golan Heights. So while the Sinai is very big and Israel could get out of it and demilitarize it, it would take the Egyptian army a full 7 days, if it were ever to violate the peace, to reach the Israeli border. But the Golan Heights is very narrow and very high. And if Israel were to get out of it, and the Syrians said, well, we change our minds. That happens in the Middle East.
Okay, but do I hear you saying you're opposed to these to the negotiations that are taking place right now between your government and the government of Syria?
No, I don't know what they are. I don't want to oppose something I don't know about. But if the idea is to significantly alter the lines of defense that now guard Israel's northern border and guard a de facto peace between us and Syria, then it's not only me who would be opposed to it, it's the majority of the Israeli people. Because, by the way, Labor and Likud, because the major thinking that goes on in this country is, here's a piece of paper.
Right.
Now imagine that this is a peace treaty. I sign it, you sign it, you're a Syrian, I'm an Israeli, we sign it, we have something called peace. Most of the wars in the world began with peace treaties. In the Middle East, we don't even have those pieces of paper. We want to get them. They're significant. But what keeps the peace in the Middle East is not the piece of paper.
Okay, but the piece of paper
is the capacity to deter war first.
Yeah, but the piece of paper can reflect mutual interest and mutual benefit. And here where the mutual benefit comes. This is AP. Prime Minister Rabin said explicitly for the first time on Thursday that Israel was prepared to return some of the Golan Heights in exchange for peace. I mean, that seems to be mutual benefit. Israel wants peace. Syria wants some of its land back. Why isn't that in the interest of Israel?
If that's what Syria would want, but it's not clear at all that Syria wants some of its land back. First of all, you say its land. This is land that was in Syrian possession up to 1967.
Right.
They attacked us for 19 years from that land. They attacked us in 67 from that land. That's how we got to be on that land, is because we were attacked from it. So the presence of Israel on the Golan Heights is not the reason for the enduring battle between Israel and Syria. What Syria has been doing as it talks peace, as it makes headlines in the New York Times, is arming itself feverishly with 450 Scuds, T-72 tanks, the latest tanks, just bought them from Czechoslovakia. It's buying Scud Cs. These are improved, targeted Scuds that they've just tested in Syria, a live test. Who are those weapons going to be aimed at?
Okay, but let me hear you out. Are you saying that under no circumstances would you, as a potential national leader of one of the two principal parties in Israel, ever want to see giving back any of the Golan Heights to Syria in exchange for some guarantee of peace?
Let me tell you, Charlie, what I would say to that is if Mr. Rabin made a statement the other day that he was talking about a few centimeters in the Golan Heights. I wouldn't oppose a few centimeters. Nobody would oppose a few centimeters. But
this is obviously worth more. They're talking about more than a few centimeters here.
But the whole Golan Heights is just a few miles wide. Right. And if you move back more than a few centimeters, you hit the hills that control the Golan Heights and control on one side the approaches to the Galilee, to the north of Israel, and the other side allow a much smaller Israeli army, whose numbers I can imagine I cannot disclose here, to cork up the biggest land army in the Middle East, which is the Syrian army. So the point is, and what you're trying to get me to say is, you're saying, well, are you going to give something up for peace?
I'm trying to get...
And I will tell you, since I think it's important to make that point. The problem of the absence of peace between Israel and Syria is not a few miles of the Golan Heights. The problem is the persistent Syrian refusal to accept the state of Israel and the use of the Golan Heights as a staging area for repeated attacks against Israel. If Syria really wanted peace, I would turn the question around and ask Mr. Assad, are you prepared to accept the principle of land for peace? Are you prepared to give up a few centimeters or a few kilometers of land that was used only to attack Israel for a peace that would give your people something a lot more than a few kilometers? It would give them the opportunity to have a real future, to have water resources that we can help them develop, to have health resources that we could help them develop, to have commerce, to have trade, to reduce the standing armies on both sides. Is that something, I think, that we should ask Mr. Assad if he's prepared to give up some of his territorial claims, or all of them, on the Golan Heights?
Then you'd be prepared to deal.
I think that would be an interesting breakthrough.
All right, let me just raise some other things about why do you think your party lost?
Well, not because of this.
Why do you think they lost, though? I mean, it is being argued that this is a new time in the Middle East after the Cold War is over and after the Persian Gulf War, different circumstances, and a new feeling even on the part of Israelis who are of a new mind about what ought to be done in terms of some of the tensions that have extracted enormous consequence in your country,
I think that
economically and otherwise.
I think there's a feeling that there are opportunities. I myself said after the Gulf War that I thought there would be opportunities for peace for the principal reason that the Gulf War showed that there was only one superpower and that the former Soviet patron doesn't exist. So,
and that patron was Syria was one of the principal countries in the Middle East that depended on the Soviet Union.
Exactly. Now, what that does, what it says, is that at the very least, some of these radical Arab regimes, and Syria is a prime example, want to make their peace with the United States. They don't necessarily want to make their peace with Israel. But if the United States says, look, the price of the ticket of entering the Western orbit or entering the bounties of munificence that we can give you, credits, technology, the ability to appeal to the Europeans and so on, if the cost of that is sitting down with the Israelis, they'll sit down with the Israelis. If the cost of that is negotiating peace with Israelis, they'll negotiate peace with Israelis.
Right. That brings
the question I'm asking, and this is the key thing to understand, we're dealing with a part of the world which is not democratic. Today, Assad signs that piece of paper. Tomorrow, he decides to revoke it. There is no public. Assad was elected with a wonderful majority. I'm running for office, you know. He was elected with 99.98% of the vote.
Nobody is suggesting that Syria is a democracy.
Well, at any point,
or
the
Jordan.
absence, you know, Immanuel Kant said 200 years ago that while democracies have voting mothers who will not readily vote for a government that will send their children readily for war, there is no such restraint, he said, in dictatorships. And what we need is a peace that will endure, a peace that cannot be revoked, unlike the piece of paper, say, that was signed by Saddam Hussein with the Shah of Iran.
Okay, stay with me, though. There seems to be a more positive attitude today because of Yitzhak Rabin is the prime minister rather than Mr. Shamir of your party. It's reflected in terms of the United States and his relationship with Israel. We now have the Bush administration enthusiastically backing the loan guarantee, right?
Good.
Okay, and you're in favor of that. Why do you think they're now doing it when they did not do it with Mr. Shamir?
Oh, I think there was a demonization.
Demonization of Mr. Shamir?
In many ways, yes. Because, you know, you talk about the principles here. Mr. Shamir was, his forte was not in public relations. But the principles, the idea of sitting down with the Syrians and trying to draw out the principles that we could agree on, and laying aside the principles we don't agree on, was something we began to probe already in the aftermath of the Madrid conference. I was there, I remember it very well. Now, I think that regardless of which government sits in Jerusalem and which government sits in Washington, Israel and the United States see basically eye to eye on the need and the benefits of peace beyond the questions of territories. Because we understand what it would mean.
And they have for a long time, since the establishment of the State of Israel.
We have our frictions, we have our differences, and changing governments have changing frictions. But I think this is a constant, and I personally would like to see that happen. The question we have to ask is, how do we engineer a peace? How do we advance a peace that will hold beyond the day of the signature? In the Middle East, at least, facing an unreconstructed dictatorship like Syria, the only kind of thing that will hold, and most Israelis agree on this, is a peace that can be defended. I think if the Syrians are on top and we're on bottom and we say, look, you just signed a peace treaty on us, but we hope you'll keep it,
okay,
most Israelis would say, we're willing to make some minor concessions. Yeah. But since the Golan Heights is so narrow, its strategic value is so high, it controls half of Israel's water, we want to be very careful.
Everybody signs on to the idea that Israel's security has to be guaranteed. Mm-hmm. The question is, what risk are you willing to take for that? Am I correct?
Yes, and I think also the question should be, what are the Arabs willing to do? What sacrifices are the Arabs who initiated this war, who attacked us from these Golan Heights? The question really should be put to the Arabs. What are you prepared to sacrifice for peace? They attacked us. We didn't attack them.
Okay. The question of settlements. Are you at one with Mr. Shamir in terms of settlements? He seemed to say in the closing days of that campaign, perhaps inadvertently, that he was prepared to stall and let the settlements continue to build up so that they could never be
I think I wouldn't
withdrawn.
stall. I wouldn't stall at all, and I was never for stalling. I think I've always wanted to seize peace because there's no one in Israel who doesn't want peace, and I certainly...
So you disagreed with Shamir on that point in terms of what he was prepared to see with respect to the settlements?
I think he was very staunch on the settlements, and I think the right of Jews to live anywhere ought to be uncontested. If I told you that Jews cannot live or settle in New Jersey, you would tell me that this would be a scandal. You probably have 5 guests on your show talking about it. The idea that Jews cannot live in Judea is remarkable. I mean, it's one of these peculiar paroxysms of truth that have convulsed here, that have changed perceptions of people.
Well, obviously you know the argument that was being made on the other side, which is that this was territory that was gained in the '67 war, and therefore it ought to be returned under the UN resolutions 342 and the other one, and therefore it ought to be the subject of negotiation. And if in fact you're settling on it now and you're building permanent settlements, then you're trying to take it out of being in play as negotiable.
Well, how many Jews have settled, to use that term, in the West Bank since 1967? About, if you exclude Jerusalem, which I think most Israelis would, about 100,000. How many Arabs outside the territories Israel has allowed to come in? About 100,000. Nobody talks about freezing Arab settlements. Yeah. Nobody says about freezing
but there's some people who are very concerned about the demographics and what happens when those Arabs come in. And
I agree, but nobody, what I'm talking right now is about the argument of changing facts on the ground. While the Arabs can bring in billions of Saudi money, oil money, and so on, while we allow them to bring the same number of Arabs who have effectively settled in the territory with, I haven't counted their children, people say that Israel, that was attacked from these territories in 1967, Israel should somehow stay away. And not only that, this is to me an apartheid conception of peace. It says Arabs can live there, but Jews can't. And we envision a peace in which Arabs, of course, will live in Israel. They do. They're equal citizens. But Jews cannot live in a peace arrangement in what ostensibly ought to be Arab territory. Now, assume for a second.
Arabs in the West Bank are equal citizens?
No, but in a peace settlement, of course, they will be. This is the whole idea, that they will be. Okay. This is an area that
Let me interrupt you. I want to take a break because I'm up against the clock, and I want to come back and give you a chance to finish the point. Benjamin Netanyahu is here. He expects and would like very much to be the leader of the Likud party and someday be prime minister of the country that he serves in the Knesset. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Benjamin Netanyahu is here. I'll let you finish, and then I want to follow up on why you think Likud lost and why there's Labor government and why there seems to be a better relationship now between the Labor government than it was and the Bush administration and the previous government.
Well, are you asking me the question now about the elections?
Right.
Well, I think the primary focus for most Israeli voters was not foreign policy. It was not the question of the settlements. I don't think this was a referendum on the territories. Although a lot of foreign observers like to report it that way. I think most Israelis and just about all political observers inside Israel believe that the reason Likud lost the election was because of the internal malfunction of the party as a party. You're not familiar with this, but the intrigues, the infighting, the personal feuding got to a level where voters said, enough. We may or may not agree with your foreign policy or economic policies, whatever you stand for. Whatever you stand for it. Don't stand on each other's legs, which is what we were doing, stomping on each other's legs.
When in fact it had been more competition for leadership in the Labor Party between Perez and Rabin in the past than had been in the Likud party.
That's correct, but that competition was resolved in a novel system for Israel, and one that you're familiar here over many years, and it's called primaries. The decision as to who would be the leader was not done by a small clique of political people who were in the business of tossing each other in and out of office. It was done by 150,000 or so voters in countrywide primaries. That was the first for Israel. I welcomed it. I thought it was very good. I'm now calling for primaries in the Likud to allow the public to make a decision and not the politicians. That sounds like a slogan, so let me be clear on that. I just initiated, fought for, and voted against my own party. In fact, that was a swing vote that enacted a bill to change Israel's political system. The next time we go for elections, which I hope to run in, we are going to have not a Knesset coalition voting, not the Congress, so to speak, voting the next Prime Minister of Israel, as we do now, but the public voting in a presidential-style American system. I think Israel is heading to a major change, and the kind of coalition blackmail that has plagued our politics is out of the window, and I'm glad I had a part in changing it.
Let me throw these larger questions at you. One is, well, one more specific question. You, in Israel, not here in the United States, criticized Prime Minister Rabin because you said that in the negotiations coming up, he seemed to be giving away everything before they sat down to negotiate. I think I've got that about right, correct?
I don't know if it's the exact quote, but I think
it was a paraphrase. You said he was giving up too many concessions before he sat down to negotiate. By stopping the settlements, by doing other things, that he was giving away the store before.
My negotiation style says that as much as I'd like to have approval in American public opinion, I'd like to care about the result on the ground first. And yes, I would negotiate differently.
What makes you think his approach is wrong?
Well, I think that if you have cards that you want to concede, usually in a negotiation, one would hold these cards closer to one's chest. But again, I don't think the primary focus of my comments, as you see, are based on the Prime Minister of Israel. I think the primary focus should be, and still is, on the Syrians. And the question is, why aren't you ready to just make peace? Why make all these conditions attached to it? And the answer is, I'm not sure they're ready for peace, but we'll find out.
Okay, let me move to the notion of, it seems to be a critical time in the Middle East. One, you have, as many people in America have pointed out, radical Arabs seem to have suffered. Radical Arabs seem to have suffered recently. Secondly, you have clearly more attention paid on those Palestinians on the West Bank and those who are part of the negotiating process in the Madrid conference and stepping forward. And thirdly, you seem to have a decline in the influence of the leadership of Yasser Arafat. Tell me what you think that presents as an opportunity.
I think there are both great opportunities and great dangers. The opportunities come from some of the things you've been describing. And the fact that the Arab world is in the grips of a big conflict between modernity and medievalism. You notice that while we're talking about changes in peace negotiations, Algeria is on the verge of going fundamentalist. They just had a coup reversed. All of North Africa is going through that convulsion. The forces of fanaticism and radicalism and nationalism arming itself with a tremendous amount of arms, all that's going on. And the question is, who's going to win out, the forces of moderation or not? I think that depends largely on the posture of the United States for the remainder of what promises to be a unipolar decade, for one decade. I'm not sure the next decade is going to have only one armed superpower. But for the moment, there is only one. So the United States has an extraordinary opportunity to tell the fanatics, to tell the fundamentalists, you're not going to have it. It's not going to work. You won't be able to arm yourself with nuclear weapons.
How would the United States tell them that?
Well, it began to tell them that in the Gulf, but the problem continues in the efforts of Saddam Hussein to develop nuclear bombs. Iran is now trying to develop nuclear bombs. As Syria has shown some indication of interest in a nuclear program. I think the United States should be very clear in forming an international coalition, with Israel, of course, but with many, many other countries, because this is not an Israeli problem. We have to make sure that these single-man regimes do not acquire weapons of mass destruction. This would be something dangerous for
all
all
right,
of us.
let me end with this.
But, before you end, I think an important point. If the reasonable men and women among the Arabs, it's mostly men because it's a patriarchal society, if they understood that waging war is dangerous for them as much as we think war is dangerous for us, if they understood that we, by cooperating with us, by getting beyond the issue of a few miles here, which can only serve as launching grounds for Israel, they're getting beyond the issue of territories and thinking about the escalating cost and dangers of war to their societies, to themselves, and understanding the growing benefits of peace in a Middle East that is going to be parched for water, that can only solve its water problem by cooperation. In a Middle East where Arab babies are dying by the millions because they don't enjoy the kind of medical care that we give the Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank. In a Middle East that is going to need different ways to feed its people, to clothe them, to educate them, because oil is not going to be around in the next century as it was in this century. If the Arabs understand the dangers of war and the benefits of peace to them, as we've understood all along for 40 years, I assure you we'll move to a different future. I believe in it. And anybody in Israel, in and out of government, or in again in government, will seize every opportunity for that kind of peace.
Good to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Benjamin Netanyahu.